In 1942, over 30,000 German soldiers reported encounters with an enemy they could not see, could not catch, and could not kill. They called them Die Nachthexen, the night witches. But here's what history forgot. These weren't hardened male commandos. They were women, teenagers mostly, flying planes made of plywood and canvas, and they terrorized the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Comment below what country you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard everywhere. The Eastern Front, summer of 1941. Nazi Germany had just launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 aircraft. The Wehrmacht rolled across Soviet soil like an iron tide, burning villages, crushing resistance, pushing deeper into the heart of Russia. Stalin's forces were in disarray. Entire divisions surrendered. Cities fell in days. The Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. But by the winter of 1942, something changed. German soldiers stationed along the southern front began reporting strange occurrences. Supplies vanished overnight. Command posts exploded without warning. Ammunition depots erupted in flame. And always, the attacks came in darkness. No engine roar, no searchlight warning, just a soft whooshing sound, like wind through leaves, followed by devastation. At first, commanders dismissed the reports as nerves, exhaustion, the brutal cold playing tricks on tired minds. But the pattern repeated, night after night, village after village. The soldiers grew paranoid. Sleep became impossible. Some refused to leave their bunkers after sunset. Others swore they heard whispers in the sky. Voices carried on the wind, taunting them in Russian. One Wehrmacht officer wrote in his diary, "We do not fear their bombs. We fear the silence before them. It is as if the dead have learned to fly." The German High Command launched investigations. They interrogated prisoners, analyzed wreckage, studied flight patterns, and what they discovered shook them to their core. The attackers weren't elite Soviet commandos. They weren't seasoned pilots with years of training. They were women, young women, some barely out of their teens, flying antique biplanes that belonged in a museum, not a war. The Nazis couldn't comprehend it. Women, in their ideology, were meant to bear children and tend homes, not wage war. But ideology doesn't stop bombs, and these women were just getting started. When Hitler's armies invaded, the Soviet Union faced annihilation. Millions of soldiers were captured or killed in the first months. The Red Army bled, but the Soviet people did not break. From the rubble of Leningrad to the fields of Ukraine, a single cry rose, "The motherland calls." And the women answered. Marina Raskova was already a legend before the war began. A record-breaking aviator, navigator, and national hero, she had flown farther than any woman in Soviet history. When war broke out, she didn't wait for permission. She went straight to Stalin himself. Her message was simple: let the women fight. Stalin, desperate for every soldier he could muster, agreed. In October 1941, Raskova was authorized to form 3 all-female aviation regiments. Not support units, not nursing corps, combat regiments. Women who would fly, bomb, and kill alongside men, or in this case, without them. Within weeks, thousands of women volunteered. University students, factory workers, teachers, dancers, girls who had never held a weapon, girls who had never even seen a plane up close. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union, united by a single burning purpose: to defend their homeland. The selection process was brutal. Physical endurance, mathematical aptitude, mechanical knowledge, psychological resilience. Out of thousands, only a few hundred were chosen. They were sent to Engels, a remote training base on the Volga River. There, in the frozen winter of 1941, they would be forged into something the world had never seen. The male officers didn't believe it would work. They mocked the recruits, called them little girls playing soldier. The uniforms didn't fit. They were sized for men, so the women stuffed boots with newspaper and cinched belts until they stayed on. The planes were ancient, obsolete trainers that had been gathering dust in hangars since the 1920s. The flight instructors were skeptical at best, hostile at worst, but Marina Raskova was unyielding. She trained them like soldiers because that's what they were. She taught them navigation by the stars because their planes had no instruments. She drilled them in night flying because darkness would be their only shield. And she told them again and again, "You are not here to prove you are equal to men. You are here to prove the enemy is not invincible. By the spring of 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was operational. They were given their aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, a wood and fabric biplane designed for crop dusting. No armor, no radio, no guns except what the navigator could hold in her lap. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt fighters flew nearly 3 times that fast. The women didn't complain. They painted their planes, sewed their own flight suits, wrote letters home, and then, on a June night in 1942, they took off toward German lines for the first time. The ghosts had risen. The Polikarpov Po-2 was never meant to be a weapon of war. It was a slow, lumbering trainer. 2 open cockpits, double wings, a wooden frame wrapped in canvas. Farmers used it to spray pesticides. Flight schools used it to teach beginners. When German intelligence first identified it over the battlefield, they laughed. Nähmaschinen, they called them. Sewing machines. The engine sounded like an old sewing machine clattering away in the night. Surely the Soviets were desperate if they were sending these into combat. But desperation breeds ingenuity, and the Night Witches turned every weakness of the Po-2 into a deadly advantage. The plane was slow, but that made it nearly impossible for German fighters to intercept. Messerschmitts had a stall speed faster than the Po-2's top speed. If a fighter tried to engage, it would overshoot and lose sight of the target. The plane was fragile, but that meant it was light enough to glide, light enough to maneuver in ways metal bombers never could. And it was silent. Here's how the Night Witches flew their missions. They took off in pairs just after sunset, when the sky turned the color of bruises. They flew low, 20 to 50 feet above the ground, to avoid radar. As they neared the target, the lead pilot would cut her engine. Completely. The only sound left was wind rushing over fabric and wood. They would glide in darkness, navigating by moonlight and memory until they were directly over the target. Then the navigator would release the bombs, crude, unguided explosives, and pull a cord to restart the engine. By the time the Germans realized they were under attack, the Po-2 was already gone, vanishing into the black. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers couldn't hear them coming, couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. Every night, the sound of wind through canvas became a harbinger of death. The troops called it Hexenbissen, the witch's broomstick. They believed the pilots were supernatural. Ghosts, demons, anything but human. One captured German soldier, interrogated by Soviet intelligence, said, "We began to think they were not women at all. Women could not do this. They must be something else. But they were women. Women who flew up to 18 missions a night. Women who returned with planes shredded by shrapnel, wings stitched back together with thread and hope. Women who watched their friends spiral into the earth in flames and took off again the next night without hesitation." The Po-2 became a symbol, not of Soviet engineering, not of military might, but of what courage looks like when it has nothing left to lose. The first raids were experimental. Small targets, isolated outposts. The Night Witches were testing themselves as much as the enemy, but within weeks, the results were undeniable. Supply convoys erupted in flame. Artillery positions went silent. German morale crumbled. By August 1942, the 588th was flying multiple sorties every night. Each pilot and navigator team would take off, drop their bombs, return to base, refuel, rearm, and take off again. 18 times in a single night. Some flew more. The missions were relentless, brutal. There was no time to rest, no time to grieve. The German response was immediate and savage. They deployed searchlights, massive, blinding beams that swept the sky, hunting for the fragile biplanes. If a Po-2 was caught in a searchlight, it was over. Anti-aircraft guns would open fire, filling the air with flak. Fighters would scramble. Few pilots survived once illuminated, so the Night Witches adapted. They flew in groups of 3. 2 planes would deliberately draw the searchlights, weaving and diving to keep the beams focused on them. The third would slip through the darkness and strike the target. Then they would switch roles. It was a dance of death, choreographed in fire and shadow. One night, a pilot named Nadezhda Popova had her engine shot out mid-flight. She glided, engineless, defenseless, over German lines for 20 minutes, riding air currents like a leaf on the wind. She landed in a field behind Soviet lines, her plane riddled with bullet holes. She counted 42. She patched the canvas with a bedsheet, restarted the engine, and flew again the next night. Another pilot, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander, flew over 800 missions. She became a legend among her peers, calm under fire, precise in navigation, and utterly fearless. German intelligence put a bounty on her head. Any soldier who shot her down would receive an Iron Cross and an immediate promotion. She was never shot down. The psychological warfare was as effective as the bombs themselves. German troops, already exhausted from the brutal winter and the endless Soviet counteroffensives, now faced an enemy that attacked when they were most vulnerable, in sleep. Sentries grew paranoid. Officers reported plummeting morale. Some units requested transfers away from the front, citing supernatural disturbances. The Night Witches didn't just drop bombs, they dropped terror. And terror, in war, is a weapon sharper than steel. Not all of them came home. By the winter of 1943, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had lost over 30 pilots and navigators. Shot down, crashed, captured. The casualty rate was staggering, but the missions never stopped. For every plane that fell, another took its place. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. At high altitude, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The open cockpits offered no protection. Pilots flew in layers of wool and leather, their faces wrapped in scarves, their hands numb on the controls. Frostbite was common. Some lost fingers, others lost toes. They kept flying. One navigator, Rufina Gasheva, wrote in her diary, "We do not fear death. We fear failing our sisters, failing our country, failing the ones who will never fly again." The planes themselves were falling apart. The Po-2 was never designed for combat. The wooden frames splintered under stress. The fabric wings tore in high winds. Mechanics worked through the night, every night, patching holes, replacing parts scavenged from wrecks. Sometimes there weren't enough planes. Pilots would wait on the tarmac, watching the sky, praying their friends returned so they could take their turn. But the losses weren't just mechanical. They were human, personal. The Night Witches lived together, flew together, and died together. When a crew didn't return, there was no time for a funeral, no time to mourn. Their names were written in a ledger, their bunks were emptied, and the war continued. One of the most haunting accounts comes from Irina Sebrova, who flew 1,008 missions, more than almost any other pilot in the regiment. She once described hearing her best friend's plane explode in mid-air just ahead of her. She couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. She flew through the burning debris, tears freezing on her cheeks, and completed her mission. When she landed, she didn't speak for 3 days, yet they kept going, not because they were fearless, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. They were fighting for survival, for their families, for the future, and they refused to let the ghosts of their fallen sisters fly alone. By 1943, the tide of war was turning. The German advance had stalled at Stalingrad. Soviet forces, bloodied but unbroken, began pushing west. And at every step, in every battle, the Night Witches were there. Their missions evolved. No longer limited to harassment raids, they began striking critical infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, command centers. Their intelligence was often provided by Soviet partisans, resistance fighters operating behind enemy lines. The Night Witches would fly deep into occupied territory, guided only by coded signals and flickering fires on the ground. One particularly daring mission targeted a German fuel depot near Taman Peninsula. The depot was heavily fortified, surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries, and protected by fighter patrols. The Night Witches attacked in waves over the course of 3 nights, until the entire facility was reduced to ash. German reports estimated the loss at over 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to ground an entire armored division for weeks. The Soviet propaganda machine took notice. Newspapers began publishing stories of the fearless women pilots. Posters depicted them as heroic defenders of the motherland, soaring through the sky with bombs in hand. They became symbols of resistance, proof that even the weakest could fight back. But the women themselves were wary of the attention. They knew the truth. They weren't symbols. They were soldiers, tired, scared, human, and they wanted the war to end. German commanders, once dismissive, now took the Night Witches seriously. They issued orders to prioritize their destruction. Fighter squadrons were redeployed. Anti-aircraft defenses were reinforced. Captured Soviet documents revealed that Hitler himself had been briefed on the regiment. He reportedly demanded their immediate extermination, but the ghosts couldn't be caught. They flew too low, too fast, too smart. And every night, as the sun set over the steppe, they rose again. In 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the Night Witches returned home. They had flown over 30,000 missions, dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. 23 of them were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. But the parades were brief. The medals were handed out quietly, and soon the world moved on. The Soviet Union, rebuilding from the ashes, had little room for stories that didn't fit the narrative. Women were needed in factories, in fields, in homes, not in cockpits. Many of the Night Witches were quietly discharged. Others were reassigned to non-combat roles. Their wartime achievements were acknowledged, but rarely celebrated. Some struggled to return to civilian life. How do you go back to teaching children after dropping bombs on enemy positions? How do you sleep in silence after years of engine roar and gunfire? Many suffered from what we now call PTSD, but in 1945 there was no name for it. No treatment, just silence. Nadezhda Popova, the pilot who glided through enemy fire with a shot-out engine, once said in an interview decades later, "We were heroes for a moment. Then we were just women again, and the world forgot." But not everyone forgot. In the ruins of Europe, in the memories of German veterans, the legend endured. Some spoke of them with respect, others with fear. A few even admitted, quietly, that they had been outmatched. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "We called them witches because we could not accept the truth, that women, barely more than girls, had beaten us, that they had made us afraid." That is the legacy they left. Not just victory, but the knowledge that courage has no gender. Today, the story of the Night Witches is finally being told. Books have been written. Documentaries filmed, memorials erected. In Russia, schoolchildren learn their names. In museums, their planes are displayed. Fragile wooden frames that once carried the weight of a nation's hope. But their impact goes beyond history books. They shattered assumptions, redefined what was possible, inspired generations of women to fight, to fly, to refuse the limits placed on them. During the Cold War, female cosmonauts trained in their shadow. In modern air forces around the world, women pilots trace their lineage back to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. And in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, the tactics they pioneered, low-altitude night raids, psychological warfare, asymmetric combat, are still used. The ghosts, it turns out, never really left. On quiet nights, in the fields of southern Russia, old villagers still tell stories of a soft whooshing sound in the darkness, of shadows that move against the wind, of women who refuse to be erased. The Night Witches flew because they had no choice, because their country was burning, because someone had to stand against the darkness. And when the world told them they were too weak, too fragile, too female to fight, they proved the world wrong. They weren't ghosts. They were flesh and bone, fear and courage. Sisters and soldiers, they were women who took to the sky in planes held together by wire and will, and they changed the course of history. The wind still carries their wings, and if you listen closely, on the right kind of night, you can still hear them flying. If you found this story powerful, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear it, because the greatest tragedy isn't that these women were forgotten, it's that they were never supposed to be remembered at all. Comment below. Who inspires you to keep going when the odds are impossible?